Hey everyone, welcome to Strange Language. A quick heads up, the podcast will no longer be a group setting where we discuss strange events. I might have guests on from time to time, but the new format of the show is going to be a solo narration on one particular topic. So with that being said, I hope you enjoy the show and continue to listen, and I hope everybody's ready to get scared by the Tallman family ghost. Welcome to Strange Language. Today we're diving into one of the most thoroughly documented hauntings in American history, the Tallman family's terrifying ordeal in Horicon, Wisconsin. This is a story that captured national attention when it aired on Unsolved Mysteries in 1988. But what makes it truly remarkable isn't just the frightening events themselves. It's the extensive documentation, police investigation, and the credible witnesses who came forward. This is the story of an ordinary family who claimed they were terrorized by supernatural forces for nearly 2 years, all seemingly triggered by a simple piece of furniture. So settle in, listener, as we explore the dark together. Our story begins on April 13th, 1986, in the small farming town of Horicon, Wisconsin. With just 3,800 residents, Horicon was the kind of place where everybody knew everyone, a safe, prosperous community about 40 miles from Madison, known primarily as a stopover on the Mississippi Flyway for migrating birds. Alan Tallman, a 32-year-old shift supervisor at a local manufacturing plant, and his 30-year-old wife, Deborah, known as Debbie, had just moved into their dream home on South Larrabee Street. The 3-bedroom ranch house was particularly new, built in 1984 with a market value of $50,400. The previous owners had lived there for only 18 months before moving out. Alan and Debbie had 2 children at the time, 7-year-old Danny and 1-year-old Marianne. Debbie was also pregnant with their 3rd child. She later told investigators that the house felt perfect. She believed they would be there for a long time. The Tallmans were, by all accounts, a typical American family. They were regular churchgoers, credible, and responsible citizens with no history of interest in the paranormal. Alan worked steady shifts to support his family, while Debbie stayed home to care for the children. Nothing in their background suggested they were the type to fabricate stories or seek attention. But within weeks of moving in, the haunting began. Problems started almost immediately, though they were subtle at first. Danny and Marianne, who had rarely been sick before, began falling ill constantly. Debbie found herself taking them to the doctor between 1 and 3 times per week. Marianne was hospitalized twice, once for chickenpox and once for an ear infection. Alan also began getting sick frequently. Initially, the family thought their illnesses might be related to the building materials in the house. Perhaps there was asbestos or some other toxic substance making them sick. But when building inspectors came to check, they found no trace of any dangerous materials. The family's pet kitten began acting strangely. One night, it ran into Alan and Debbie's room, jumped on the dresser, and somehow attached itself to a plaster wall. Another time, it crashed directly into a wall. Eventually, they decided to find a new home for the animal. Other odd incidents started to happen. Danny and his babysitter witnessed the kitchen chair bouncing around and rocking back and forth on its own. In the fall of 1986, Debbie was diagnosed with placenta previa, a serious pregnancy complication, and doctors ordered her not to perform any housework. Her mother and sister came to help, but both had immediate negative reactions to the house. They described feeling suffocated and said the house felt oppressive. Debbie's mother couldn't wait to leave, and her sister would get headaches and feel sick whenever she visited. Around this time, Alan's personality began to change. At night, he would become short-tempered and easily irritated, arguing with Debbie over trivial matters. One night, he threatened to leave the family and went on a drinking binge, behavior that was completely out of character for him. In November, Debbie gave birth to their second daughter, Sarah. The family now had 3 children, and they would soon make a decision that would change everything. In early February 1987, Alan and Debbie made what seemed like a practical decision. They purchased a bunk bed at a second-hand furniture shop and stored it in their basement. The plan was to set it up so that Mary Ann and Sarah could share a room while Danny would move into the bedroom next door. In May 1987, they moved the bunk bed into Danny's old bedroom. Danny inherited his father's old clock radio when he moved to his new room. The first night, something unprecedented happened. The radio began moving back and forth between stations on its own. Danny ran to the living room to tell his parents what was happening, but they didn't believe him and sent him back to bed. A few minutes later, Danny witnessed the radio dial sliding from one side to the other a second time. Again, he told his parents, but they assumed he was having some kind of fit with the radio and simply removed it from his room. From that night forward, Danny had trouble sleeping. He would kick and scream when it was time for bed and rarely slept through the night. He complained of hearing someone walk across the bedroom floor and loud bangs from the basement water pipes. Then came the incident that would haunt the family's memory. Danny saw a suitcase slide out from under his bed, zoom across the floor, and then slide back under the bed. He ran from the room, crying to his parents, but they didn't believe him and took him back to bed. When it happened again minutes later, Alan removed the suitcase from the room, though they still assumed Danny was making up stories for attention. Meanwhile, the daughters sharing the bunk bed, Mary Ann and Sarah, began having their own troubles. They would wake up in the middle of the night crying and couldn't fall back asleep. Mary Ann started having nightmares and told her parents about a voice in her room that would shush her. Sometimes, Alan and Debbie would hear their giggling and talking to someone when they were alone in the room. As the summer of 1987 progressed, the paranormal activity in the house intensified. Alan would sometimes stay in the children's bedrooms to help them fall asleep. While in Danny's room one night, he heard what sounded like rats moving through the walls. He and Debbie searched the house extensively. The house was well insulated, and there were no signs of infestation. In September, Debbie began hearing the garage door open and close by itself. She also started suffering nightmares, which she had rarely experienced before moving into the house. These weren't ordinary bad dreams. In one reoccurring nightmare, intruders would come up from the basement, line the family up against the wall, then shoot them, one by one. She also had nightmares about the children being kidnapped or drowning in a river. The dreams were so vivid and disturbing that she wondered if she was going mad. For months, the family rarely discussed the strange occurrences. They were each dealing with their own frightening experiences, but perhaps hoping that by not talking about them, they would go away. One evening in late September, Alan was painting the basement walls when Debbie called him upstairs for dinner. He laid his brush on the paint tray and went to eat. About half an hour later, he returned downstairs, only to find the brush on the opposite side of the table with its handle jammed into the paint bucket and the bristles sticking straight up. A few minutes later, he believed he saw a shadow dart across the basement. This was the moment Alan first acknowledged to himself that something strange was happening in the house, though he still couldn't accept that it might be haunted. More incidents followed. One morning, Alan found the basement window had been completely removed and was neatly propped up against the wall. Nothing had been stolen from the house, and Debbie noted that a chair would have been needed to exit through the window. After this incident, Debbie rarely went into the basement alone, and if she did, she always felt as though she was being watched. The family adopted a dog for protection, but the animal behaved just as strangely as their cat had. It would bark at the house when outside, and once inside, it would scratch at the door to go back out. The Tallman's dog wasn't the only animal affected. At night, neighborhood dogs would bark at the Tallman house for no apparent reason. Alan began feeling increasingly uneasy whenever he came home. He felt like something was waiting for him in the garage, watching his every movement. When he closed the garage door, he later said he felt like he was shutting himself in a tomb. Walking from the garage into the house one night, he felt a sharp tug on his lunch pail. Thinking it was one of the kids or Debbie, he turned. No one was there. In late October 1987, Alan began suffering from a severe sinus infection. A few nights later, his condition worsened dramatically. He was coughing, vomiting, and having trouble breathing. Debbie took him to the hospital, and his mother came over to watch the children. Alan's mother, like other family members, immediately felt uncomfortable in the house. She couldn't wait to leave. After the children went to bed, she fell asleep on the living room couch. In the middle of the night, she woke up to see glowing red eyes staring at her through the window. The children's experiences were becoming more frequent and more terrifying. One night in late November, Mary Ann told Debbie she saw a fire in her room. She also said someone was watching her. She was so frightened that Debbie had to sit with her until she fell asleep. Over the next few days, Mary Ann continued talking about fires on the door and windows, and she said someone was hiding behind her door, waiting until the lights went out to attack her. Debbie would again hear Mary Ann giggling, laughing, and talking in the middle of the night. The little girl would join her parents in bed and say, "It's coming, it's here." When they asked who was coming, she would become upset and ask why they couldn't see or hear it. Alan and Debbie initially thought Mary Ann was fabricating stories, and they didn't mention what she had seen to Danny. A month later, Danny independently told Debbie that he had seen a 4-foot-tall, hideous old woman with long black hair standing by his door. He said the woman glowed like fire. Debbie told him it was his imagination and that he should go back to sleep. He did. A few moments later, the woman returned. Debbie stayed with Danny for the rest of the night. This was the turning point. With both children describing similar apparitions, Alan and Debbie accepted that their house was haunted. Desperate and frightened, the Tallmans turned to their pastor, Reverend Wayne DeBratz of St. Stephen's Lutheran Church. DeBratz would later become a key witness in this case, and his testimony carries significant weight because of his position in the community and his initial skepticism. When Reverend DeBratz visited the house, he immediately felt the presence of what he described as evil. He believed the Tallmans were victims of demonic forces. He blessed the house and gave them religious music to play, asking them to pray, read Bible passages, and attend church every Sunday. Despite the prayers, the haunting continued. The Tallmans claimed they never had a moment's peace. Doors would bang open and shut. Strange voices would call to them from empty rooms. Visions persisted, and the children were terrorized. They followed Debbie around the house because they were too afraid to be alone. For Debbie, the nights became chaos. The week before Christmas, the situation reached a new level of terror. Danny started sleeping on the living room couch because he was too afraid to sleep in his own room. At around 3 a.m. one night, he saw the old woman again, standing by the Christmas tree. He asked her what she wanted, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stared intently at him. She appeared to him 3 times that night, getting bigger each time. Alan had begun having visions of coming home from work to find his family brutally murdered. By Christmas, he had reached his breaking point. He felt he could no longer control what was happening in his house. In desperation, Alan decided to confront whatever was tormenting his family. He yelled out, "Whatever is in our house, would you please leave my children alone? And if you want to fight, fight with me." The next night, he had a nightmare in which a tornado was heading for the house, and he couldn't find his family. It was as if his challenge had been accepted, and the entity was preparing to respond. 2 weeks later, on Thursday, January 7th, 1988, at around 2 a.m., Alan returned home from working the late shift. As he approached the front door, he heard an eerie howling and a strong gust of wind coming from the direction of the garage. As he was about to open the door, the wind became stronger, reminding him of the tornado from his nightmare. A voice whispered, "Come here." Alan ran around the side of the house, thinking someone might be playing a prank on him. However, no one was there. After a moment of bafflement, he returned to the front door, only for the wind to start up again. The voice loudly and repeatedly called, "Come here." When Alan looked at the garage, he saw flames coming out of it. Through the garage door windows, he could see two shimmering blood-red eyes looking directly at him. Terrified, Alan ran inside, set his lunch pail on the floor, slammed the door shut, and locked it. He stood there for a few seconds, then said, "Oh my God, my garage is on fire." He ran back outside to check on the garage. When he looked at it, the flames were gone, and there was no evidence that a fire had ever occurred. The wind was also gone. He went back inside and deadbolted the door. As he reached down to pick up his lunch pail, an invisible entity threw the pail across the living room into the kitchen. Alan ran into the bedroom and jumped into bed with Debbie. Debbie had never seen her husband so terrified. She asked him what was wrong. He asked if she had heard the howling. She had not. Both stayed awake the rest of the night with the lights on. The final weekend of the haunting would prove to be the worst. On the afternoon of Saturday, January 9th, Alan's 16-year-old brother Jonathan was visiting. Standing outside the house, they saw a floating red light in the garage. When they entered the garage to investigate, the light had vanished. That night, Alan slept on the floor in Marianne and Sarah's room. The girls were traumatized and needed help falling asleep. This decision would lead to the most terrifying encounter of the entire case. While lying on the floor, Alan heard the same howling sound he had experienced outside a few nights earlier. A fog rose from the floor and surrounded him. It reached the ceiling and transformed into a human-like figure with red eyes. The entity raised its arm, pointed directly at him, and said, "You're dead," before disappearing in a burst of light. When Alan staggered out of the bedroom, he couldn't speak. His lips were blue and his skin was white. Debbie's first thought was that he was having a heart attack. She tried to get him to tell her what had happened. All he could say was, "Leave me alone." Debbie immediately called Reverend DeBratz, who arrived within minutes. The pastor noticed Alan was frightened and shaking uncontrollably. He urged the family to leave the house immediately. The Tallmans took his advice. They left immediately to stay with relatives. As they were driving away, Debbie saw a small, intense flame at the top of the garage door that quickly disappeared. The next night they returned home. Reverend DeBratz blessed the house again, led them in prayers and communion, and told them to play religious music all night. That night they had no problems, but the following night, Monday, January 11th, would be their last in the house. Alan was working late that night, so he asked his brother Jonathan to watch over Marianne and Sarah until they fell asleep. Jonathan was a complete skeptic about the paranormal. That night changed his mind forever. At around 8 p.m., while lying on the floor in the girls' room, Jonathan heard Sarah say, "Hi there." When he turned towards her, he saw the same entity that Alan had encountered 2 nights earlier. As the figure moved towards him, it said, Now you're involved." It then melted into the floor. Jonathan screamed and yelled for Debbie, but she was too frightened to enter the bedroom. She asked Danny to see what was happening, and he said, "It's there. I can see it." Marianne came out and confirmed that she could see it too. Finally, Jonathan came out of the bedroom, visibly shaken. When Debbie asked him what happened, he simply said it was in the bedroom. She asked where Sarah was, and he said she was still in the room. Debbie told him to get Sarah immediately. They were leaving. As they pulled out of the driveway, Danny yelled, "Mom, it's looking out the window at us." Debbie took his word for it and refused to look back. They drove to Alan's workplace to tell him what had happened. Debbie refused to return to the house. Later that night, Alan drove past the house. All of its lights were on. Later, Debbie would assure him only the living room light and the light in Danny's room had been on when they'd left. The Tallman family would never spend another night in the home. The next morning, Alan returned to the house to gather some belongings. Only the living room light was on, and the light in Danny's room was off. He could find no electrical problems to explain the lights turning on and off by themselves. Within a few days, they had collected the rest of their belongings and moved in with relatives. Reverend Bratz and another pastor conducted a house cleansing ritual involving prayers and scripture readings. But the story was far from over. Rumors about the haunting began to spread through the small town of Horicon. Some claimed there was a portal to hell in the basement, that blood dripped from the walls, and that a snowblower cleared the driveway on its own. Dozens of people drove by or congregated around the house. The situation became so disruptive that police briefly barricaded the street to keep people away. On January 1st, Horicon Police Chief Doug Glaman contacted Alan. The family was still frightened and had trouble sleeping. Alan was initially unwilling to discuss the case because he didn't want to seem crazy. However, Chief Glaman convinced the Tallmans to come to the police station to discuss their experiences. This is where the case becomes truly remarkable from an investigative standpoint. Chief Glaman was a law enforcement professional with no stake in promoting paranormal beliefs. After meeting with the Tallmans, he believed they were sincere and had been through an emotionally draining experience. He promised them confidentiality and tried to protect them from the press and curiosity seekers. Chief Glaman also convinced them to meet with Milwaukee Sentinel journalist James Nelson to help dispel some of the wilder rumors about the haunting. Nelson would later write extensively about the case and become convinced of the family's sincerity. On January 25th, Chief Glaman and two officers visited the abandoned house to conduct their own investigation. While they were there, the phone rang several times. When they would answer, the line would be dead. They disabled the receiver, but the phone rang again. Once again, the line was dead. This was just the beginning of the official investigation. Chief Glaman spent 3 hours in the house with Reverend Bratz, looking for any evidence of a hoax. They searched for hidden recorders, projection devices, or any other equipment that might have been used to fake the phenomena. They found nothing. Chief Glaman then brought in an outside investigator and an electrical engineer to examine the house. They also found no evidence of fraud or technical trickery. Not satisfied with these results, Chief Glaman contacted several academic experts. Social welfare professor Dr. Don Mueller, parapsychologist Carl Schultz, and retired parapsychology professor Walter Uphoff. On January 31st, this team of investigators visited the house. Carl Schultz, who claimed to have psychic abilities, reported hot spots in several parts of the home, particularly in the basement and near where the bunk bed had been located. Walter Uphoff theorized that a spirit might be attached to the house, the land, or some piece of furniture. He noted that changing living arrangements, such as when the children switched rooms, could have upset a spiritual entity. The team of investigators found no evidence of fraud. They believed the Tallmans' experiences were genuine. During the investigation, several theories were proposed to explain the events. Some speculated that the house was built on Native American burial ground. Chief Tallman searched the land records and found no evidence to support this theory. The area had been marshland before houses were built there. Skeptics suggested that black mold, trapped marsh gas, methane seeping into the house, or a natural gas leak might have caused the experiences. Interestingly, a year after the Tallmans moved out, Wisconsin Power and Light Company did replace faulty gas fittings at some of their Horicon houses. However, no faulty fittings were found at the Tallman house or any others on that street. The company noted that they had not checked for gas leaks at the home during the time of the hauntings. On February 13, 1988, the Tallmans made a decision that would become one of the most memorable aspects of their case. They had the bunk bed destroyed and buried in a private landfill. The family had theorized, along with Reverend Bratz, that the bunk bed was somehow connected to the haunting. The pastor wondered if the bed had been used for seances, or if someone had introduced occult forces to the house through the furniture. The Tallmans themselves wondered if someone had a grudge against them and had used black magic or witchcraft to curse the bed. By this time, the story had attracted plenty of media attention. The case was featured on the television show A Current Affair, and journalist James Nelson wrote extensively about it for the Milwaukee Sentinel. The story would later be included in the book Haunted America by Michael Norman and Beth Scott. Most famously, the case was featured on the October 26, 1988 Halloween episode of Unsolved Mysteries, alongside stories about the Queen Mary, the General Wayne Inn, and the Tatum House. The Tallman segment is considered one of the most frightening and well-known paranormal cases in the show's history. For the Unsolved Mysteries episode, the Tallmans requested that they be filmed in silhouette and that actors portray them in the reenactments, and that their children's real names not be used. The reenactments were actually filmed in their former house with the new owner's permission. Interestingly, Horicon's mayor did not allow Police Chief Tallman to be interviewed for the broadcast, possibly to avoid further publicity for the small town. The Tallmans moved to a new home in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, where they went on to experience no more paranormal phenomena. However, the psychological effects of their ordeal lingered. Debbie remained afraid of the dark and being alone at night. She believed it would take time for things to return to normal. When people asked if the entity could follow them to their new home, Debbie admitted she didn't know. She had never thought such things could be possible in the first place, so she couldn't be sure if moving meant the end of their nightmare. In April 1988, a new family moved into the Tallmans' former house. Initially, they reported no problems, which seemed to support the theory that the haunting was somehow connected to the family rather than to the house itself. However, by January 1989, Police Chief Tallman had become somewhat skeptical of the Tallman story. He believed they had received money for appearing on Unsolved Mysteries and had sold their story to author Michael Norman. This financial aspect raised questions about their motives, though it's worth noting that journalist James Nelson had earlier reported that the Tallmans lost $3,000 when they allowed their mortgage holder to assume the house's title, and they had turned down $5,000 offered by the National Enquirer because they didn't want to profit from their children's suffering. In 1994, 6 years after fleeing the home, the Tallmans reported that their lives had significantly improved and that they had experienced nothing paranormal since leaving the house. So what are we to make of the Tallman case? From a paranormal investigation standpoint, this case is remarkable. First, the extensive documentation. We have police reports, newspaper articles, interviews with multiple witnesses, and testimony from religious and academic professionals. The case was investigated by law enforcement, parapsychologists, and journalists who came to believe the family's account. Second, the credibility of the witnesses. The Tallmans were described by investigators as responsible citizens with no history of seeking publicity or financial gain from paranormal claims. Police Chief Glayman initially found them credible, as did journalists James Nelson and the academic investigators. Third, the consistency of the accounts. Multiple family members described similar phenomena, and skeptical witnesses like Jonathan, Alan's brother, had their own frightening encounters. Skeptics do raise valid points, though. The case did attract plenty of media attention, and the family did eventually profit from their story through book deals and television appearances. Some neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual, and there were suggestions that the family's financial difficulties might have motivated them to fabricate the story. The theory that a gas leak or other environmental factor caused hallucinations is intriguing, though investigators at the time found no evidence of these problems. The discovery of faulty gas fittings in other homes a year later adds some credibility to the theory, even though no problems were found at the Tallmans' house specifically. There's also the psychological aspect to consider. The family was under significant stress from frequent illnesses, financial problems, and the challenges of raising young children. Could these stressors have contributed to a shared delusion or mass hysteria? Whether you believe the family encountered supernatural forces or experienced an elaborate series of coincidences and psychological phenomena, the case offers a fascinating glimpse into how ordinary people respond to extraordinary. The house on South Larrabee Street still stands today, and according to reports, subsequent owners have experienced no paranormal activity. The bunk bed that the family blamed for their ordeal remains buried in a Wisconsin landfill, where it can no longer terrorize anyone. For Alan, Debbie, and their children, the case represents a traumatic period in their lives that took years to overcome. Whether their experiences were supernatural or psychological, the fear they experienced was undeniably real. The Tallman case raises important questions about the nature of reality, the power of belief, and the lengths to which people will go to protect their families from perceived threats. It reminds us that sometimes the most compelling mysteries are not those that can be easily explained, but those that challenge our understanding of what is possible. As for the truth behind the Tallman haunting, that remains, like so many paranormal cases, unsolved. And that's it, the Tallman case. I really hope you enjoyed the podcast. I hope everybody enjoys this new format. I've got another one planned out for next month. I won't say what it's going to be on yet. But if you enjoyed this one, I think you'll like that one too. So go on and subscribe, and thank you for listening.